Welcome back to the Sera Werewolf Romance collection, where the Omegas refuse to bow and the Alphas always meet their match. Quick question for the pack before we dive into the fire. Where are you listening from right now? Let me know in the comments, and drop a fire emoji if you want a pet tortoise just like Oz. Let's do a quick recap. In part 1, our defiant floor scrubber Sophie tripped over her tortoise and launched a tray of raw steaks at a stranger in a black suit. That stranger turned out to be the Dragon Emperor. He scorched the meat in his bare hand and dragged Sophie up into his glass castle in the clouds. Today, we finish the fight. Alpha Noctar brings his war to the sky, a magic sword gets melted, and the terrifying Dragon King does something no one expects. He drops to his knees. But before we start, if you want to support the channel and get early access to stories like this, hit that join button down below. It helps keep the lights on and the romance burning. Now, take a deep breath. The wolves are at the gate and the Emperor is ready. Let's read. Chapter 21. The echo of the gunshot rolled over the mountain peak. Silence gripped the courtyard. Red emergency lights bathed the combatants in a bloody glow. Thick black powder smoke drifted across the shattered floor, carrying the bitter scent of sulfur. Sophie held her breath. Her fingers dug into the metal doorframe of the sleek vessel. She stared at the unmoving figure lying in the debris of the ruined stone planter. The heavy steel slug hit its mark with the force of a falling boulder. The kinetic shockwave threw the Emperor through the air, tearing the weapon from his grip. A grating scrape of metal against stone pierced the quiet. Veraxis shifted. He rolled onto his side. He planted a palm on the cracked crystal and pushed himself up onto one knee. A collective gasp swept through the Lycan ranks. The Emperor stood. His shirt hung in tatters. The fabric around his spine was shredded. Beneath the ruined cloth, a thick layer of black scales covered his skin. In the split second before the bullet struck, his body reacted to the lethal threat. His innate magic forced a partial shift. The biological armor hardened over his bones. The projectile hit the scales and flattened, failing to pierce his vital organs. Veraxis reached behind his back. He dug his fingers into the dense, armored plating on his spine. He pried the crushed chunk of steel loose. Veraxis dropped the bullet. The steel, partially melted into a jagged glob from the heat of his scales, hit the stone with a dull, heavy hiss. "You missed, dog." His voice did not sound human. It carried a dual, echoing growl that vibrated in the chests of everyone listening. The temperature in the courtyard rocketed. Orange flames licked up his forearms, bright and furious. The battle resumed with a deafening roar. The brief pause shattered into total chaos. The scale guard charged forward. Their fury ignited at the sight of their injured king. They clashed with the Iron Claw enforcers, direct the wolves back toward the hijacked transports. The air filled with the clash of swords, the crack of heavy chains, and the shouts of dying warriors. Alpha Noctar lowered his smoking weapon. His cruel grin melted into a snarl of sheer confusion and rage. He discarded the empty iron hand cannon. He let it hit the metal ramp. He did not bother to reload. He roared, a guttural sound that tore through the mountain air, and pointed a clawed finger across the chaotic landing pad. He pointed straight at Sophie. "Grab the traitor!" Noctar bellowed over the noise of the fight. "Bring her to me!" Two Lycan enforcers broke away from the main skirmish. They were towering mountains of muscle. Their leather vests strained over broad chests. They locked eyes on the Omega standing in the open doorway. Panic flooded Sophie's veins, sharp and cold. She spun around, searching the stone floor near the ramp. She spotted the small iron handle of her dropped blade resting on the metal ramp. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, desperate to reach the tool. The heavy boots of the enforcers slammed onto the stone. They moved with terrifying speed, dodging a clash of swords to reach her position. Sophie grabbed the knife. She gripped the leather handle tight and pushed herself up. Staying near the ship meant getting trapped inside the cabin. She needed open space. She turned and sprinted toward the perimeter of the courtyard. She ducked under a swinging chain. She vaulted over the body of a fallen guard. The wind tore at her hair as she navigated the brutal war zone. She headed for the eastern edge of the landing pad, aiming to put as much distance between herself and the transport ramp as possible. The enforcers gave chase. Their long strides chewed up the distance. They shoved fighting warriors out of their path, their focus locked on the fleeing Omega. Sophie reached the perimeter. A high crystal railing offered the only barrier between the solid floor and the sheer, fat drop into the clouds. The wind whipped past the edge, biting at her cheeks. She spun around, raising her small weapon. The two wolves closed in. They spread out, stepping in unison to box her against the railing. There was nowhere left to run. Chapter 22. The high crystal railing pressed hard against Sophie's spine. The fatal abyss loomed behind her, hidden by the darkness and the storm. The biting wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She stood her ground, holding the dull iron blade out in front of her. The two Lycan enforcers closed the trap. They stepped over a shattered piece of the courtyard floor, their boots crunching on the glass. They did not draw weapons. They intended to drag her back to the Alpha with their bare hands. The first wolf lunged. He reached out with a scarred, thick hand, aiming to grab the collar of her coat. Sophie dropped low. She evaded the grasping fingers and drove the heel of her boot straight into his kneecap. The impact sent a sickening crack echoing over the wind. The wolf grunted. His leg buckled, dropping him to one knee. The second attacker stepped over his injured partner. He swung a heavy fist toward Sophie's head. She raised her arms, taking a glancing blow to her shoulder, and twisted her body. She slashed the iron blade across the incoming arm. The metal edge caught the exposed skin above his leather bracer, tearing a deep gash. Blood sprayed across the pristine crystal floor. The wolf roared in pain, clutching his bleeding forearm. Sophie backed up, her heel hitting the base of the railing. She had drawn blood, but she lacked the brute strength to finish the fight. The first wolf recovered. He pushed through the pain of his ruined knee and surged forward. He backhanded Sophie across the face. The strike carried the force of a swinging hammer. She hit the crystal railing hard. The breath left her lungs in a rush. White stars exploded in her vision. She tasted copper. Her fingers went numb, and the iron blade slipped from her grasp, clattering away across the smooth stone. She slumped against the barrier, fighting the overwhelming urge to black out. The injured wolf stepped forward, wrapping his hand around her throat. He lifted her off her feet, cutting off her air supply. A roar of pure heat swept the courtyard. A towering wall of orange flame erupted from the floor, shooting 10 feet into the air. The fire formed a blinding, searing barrier right between the crystal railing and the rest of the battlefield. The sudden blaze scorched the oxygen from the air. The wolf holding Sophie let out a terrified scream. The intense heat blistered his exposed skin. He dropped her to the floor and scrambled backward, shielding his face from the blistering inferno. Both enforcers retreated, their armor smoking from the proximity to the magical fire. Sophie hit the ground, gasping for air. She rubbed her bruised throat, coughing as she looked up. The wall of flames parted. Veraxis stepped through the fire. The blaze bent around his form, refusing to touch him. He did not look human. The partial shift that saved his life now spread across his body. Thick, shimmering scales coated his arms from the elbows down to his hands. Sharp, curved talons replaced his fingernails. He raised a scaled hand. A concentrated stream of flames shot from his palm. The strike was precise and devastating. It caught the lead enforcer square in the chest. The leather armor ignited. The wolf stumbled backward, shrieking as the magical heat consumed his gear. He thrashed against the stone, trying to extinguish the flames, but dragonfire proved impossible to smother. He tumbled across the platform, a rolling ball of fire, before crashing into the base of a decorative planter. The second wolf turned and fled toward the cargo lifters, abandoning the hunt. Veraxis knelt beside Sophie. He reached out and grasped her arm, pulling her up from the floor. The ambient heat radiating from his chest chased away the freezing chill of the wind. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. The dual, monstrous layer remained in his voice. She rubbed her jaw, spitting a drop of blood onto the crystal floor. "I have had worse." He pulled her behind his broad frame, keeping his body positioned between her and the open courtyard. The battle raged on around them, a chaotic mess of red lights and clashing steel. Noctar stood on the cracked floor near the transports. He watched his burning enforcer stop moving. He looked up and met the Emperor's stare across the battlefield. Veraxis let the fire travel up his scaled forearms. He prepared to settle the dispute. The sky and the dirt were about to collide, and he intended to turn the dirt to ash. Chapter 23. Veraxis strode toward the center of the shattered courtyard. The red emergency lights reflected off the jagged shards of crystals scattered across the stone. He walked with the deliberate, terrifying calm of an apex predator closing in on its prey. "Stand down!" he bellowed. The command carried a supernatural weight, vibrating through the bones of every fighter on the platform. The scale guard obeyed without hesitation. They stepped back, disengaging from their targets. They lowered their long steel weapons and formed a wide perimeter around the center of the landing pad. The Lycan enforcers halted their attacks, panting hard. They looked toward their alpha for guidance. The noise of the battle died away, leaving only the howling wind and the crackle of distant flames. Noctar stood near the bulky cargo lifter. He cracked his knuckles, rolling his thick neck. He enjoyed the sudden spotlight. This was the exact moment he had planned for years, a direct, unhindered confrontation with the ruler of the clouds. Veraxis stopped in the middle of the open space. He spotted his fallen broadsword resting on the stone a few feet away. He walked over and scooped the heavy weapon up by the hilt. He pointed the tip of the steel straight at the Lycan leader. "You bring your mutts to my home," Veraxis stated, his dual voice carrying over the wind. "You hide behind iron cannons and stolen transports. Finish this dispute with me, Alpha." Noctar sneered. He reached up and grabbed the collar of his vest. With a violent jerk, he tore the garment in half, tossing the ruined material onto the ground. His bones began to snap. The sound was sickening, resembling thick tree branches breaking under extreme weight. Noctar's spine elongated, arching his back at an unnatural angle. Coarse, dark gray fur burst from his pores, covering his skin in seconds. His jaw pushed forward, extending into a terrifying wolfish snout lined with razor-sharp teeth. He grew in size, expanding until he towered over the tallest scale guard. The Alpha shifted into his full beast form. He became a nightmare of muscle, claw, and unchecked rage. He dropped to all fours, letting out a roar that shook the glass windows of the zenith. Sophie watched from the edge of the crystal railing. Her blood ran hot. She refused to stand by unarmed. She pushed into her magic, her eyes flashing wolf gold and sharp claws extending from her fingers as she shifted partially to provide backup. She had witnessed the Alpha transform before, but never with this level of murderous intent. In his beast form, Noctar looked like an unstoppable force of nature. Veraxis watched the transformation. He did not flinch. He did not retreat. The Emperor shifted his grip on the broadsword. Then he tossed the heavy steel weapon away. It clattered against the debris, sliding out of bounds. He chose to fight the beast barehanded. Veraxis embraced his humanoid shift. The black scales on his back and arms spread further, crawling up his neck and dusting his cheekbones. His teeth sharpened, elongating into wicked fangs. The heat rolling off his body warped the air around him, creating a shimmering mirage over the cold mountain peak. Noctar dug his bat claws into the shattered crystal floor, searching for traction on the slick surface. He lowered his huge head, baring his teeth. "Come," Veraxis challenged, his tone cold and steady. The Alpha launched himself across the courtyard. He moved with brutal, blinding speed, clearing the distance in 3 long bounds. He lunged for the Emperor's throat, jaws wide, aiming to end the war in a single, crushing bite. Veraxis stood his ground. The orange fire erupted from his chest, blazing bright in the dark night. He raised his clawed, scaled hands, ready to meet the monster head-on. The two rulers collided in the center of the platform. Chapter 24. The impact sounded like a falling boulder hitting a steel vault. Noctar crashed into Veraxis. The sheer kinetic weight of the Lycan beast pushed the Emperor backward. Veraxis dug his heels into the stone, his boots grinding a shallow trench across the surface, halting the Alpha's forward momentum. He caught the wolf's snapping jaws with his bare hands, his black dragon talons digging deep into the thick gray fur around Noctar's neck. The beast thrashed, snapping its teeth inches from Veraxis's face. Hot, foul breath washed over the Emperor. Noctar utilized his superior speed. He abandoned the bite and swung his front paw. The razor-sharp lichen claws tore through the dark fabric of Veraxis's shirt. The strike caught the seam between the black scales, slicing through the softer skin beneath the armor plating. Dark, hot blood welled from the deep cuts, hissing as it hit the freezing mountain air. Veraxis grunted. The pain registered, sharp and sudden. He countered the strike without hesitation. He pushed his glowing palms flat against the beast's chest. He unleashed a concentrated blast of pure, white-hot heat. The fire scorched Noctar's fur, burning past the outer layer down to the skin. The acrid smell of roasting flesh choked the courtyard. The Alpha yelped, a high, pained sound, and scrambled backward, desperate to escape the searing agony. Noctar shook his head, clearing the pain. He began to circle. He kept his body low to the ground, his yellow eyes tracking the fresh blood dripping from the Emperor's ribs. Smoke curled from the blackened patch on his chest. Veraxis ignored his bleeding wound. The magical fire coursing through his veins began to cauterize the cuts, searing the edges closed, but the physical damage slowed his movements. He turned, keeping his chest facing the circling wolf. Sophie gripped the crystal railing. She watched the brutal dance unfold. Noctar possessed the advantage of raw speed and thick muscle in his beast form. Veraxis held the power of fire and armor, but the Alpha learned fast, avoiding direct contact and darting in for quick, slashing strikes. Noctar lunged again. He faked a high bite, dropping his weight at the last second. He swiped at Veraxis's knee. The Emperor jumped, avoiding the crippling blow, but Noctar used the opening. The wolf slammed his heavy shoulder into Veraxis's chest. The hit sent the Emperor tumbling across the courtyard. He hit the ground hard, sliding across the slick crystal surface and crashing into a pile of broken stone. Noctar did not pause. He charged after the fallen ruler, intending to pin him to the floor and rip his throat out before he could stand. Veraxis rolled. He sprang back to his feet just as the wolf arrived. He sidestepped the charge, bringing his sharp talons down in a brutal arc across Noctar's flank. The strike drew a long line of blood, but the thick muscle absorbed the worst of the damage. The beast spun around, unfazed by the cut. He stood tall on his hind legs and barked a sharp, commanding sound. It was an alpha order, directed not at the Emperor, but at the Lycan enforcers watching the duel from the perimeter. Noctar broke the ancient rules of single combat. He called his pack. 4 burly wolves broke rank. They charged the Emperor from behind, raising their iron chains while Noctar engaged him from the front. Veraxis turned his head, spotting the incoming ambush. His eyes glowed with lethal fury. He blasted a wave of fire at the approaching enforcers, forcing them to dive for cover. The distraction gave Noctar the exact opening he needed. The Alpha leaped, jaws wide, aiming to clamp his teeth around the Emperor's spine and finish the war on his own terms. Chapter 25. The ambush collapsed before it began. Veraxis swept his armored arm in a wide, brutal arc. A concentrated jet of flame chased the 4 iron claw enforcers across the platform. The magical heat scorched their armor, forcing them to dive for cover behind the wrecked cargo lifters. They abandoned their leader, choosing survival over loyalty. The distraction cost the Emperor his footing. The hulking wolf capitalized on the opening. The beast launched its entire weight at the dragon. Veraxis brought his hands up, catching the monster by the thick fur of its neck. The kinetic force of the tackle drove them both backward. Sparks flew from the Emperor's boots. He dug his heels into the platform, trying to anchor himself. They crossed the threshold of the impact zone. The heavy transport had compromised the structural integrity of this entire quadrant upon arrival. Deep, jagged fractures spread across the transparent floor. Beneath the ruined surface, the violent storm raged. A dizzying drop into the clouds promised certain death for anyone who fell through. The glass groaned under their combined weight. Sophie watched the trap close. The Emperor bled from the deep cuts across his ribs. The relentless physical assault drained his stamina. The Alpha did not need to win a contest of strength. He just needed to force his enemy onto the weakest panel of the crater. He is going to shatter the floor beneath him, she realized. The glass will give out, and he will drop into the abyss. She stood near the perimeter barrier, her chest heaving. The uncut gem bumped against her thigh, a heavy reminder of the protection he offered her. She could not stand on the sidelines and watch him fall. She pushed off the barrier and ran. She did not have a plan. She lacked a weapon. She just needed to draw the Alpha's attention away from the fractured floor. Before she took 3 steps, a steel grip clamped over her bicep. Wing Lord Rendar stepped into her path. The aerial general wore the standard silver armor of the elite guard, holding a longsword in his free hand. He yanked her backward, pulling her behind the safety line of the inner courtyard. "Hold your ground, dirt dweller," Rendar ordered. "You step into that ring, you die." Sophie thrashed against his hold. She kicked at his armored shins. "Let me go! Look at the floor! The wolf is pushing him into the crater!" Rendar did not budge. He stood like a stone statue. "The king fights his own battles. A servant does not interfere." "Your king is bleeding out. The glass is breaking." "It is forbidden." Rendar tightened his grip, his fingers bruising her skin. "You stay here. That is an order." Sophie glared at the armored general. She hated orders. She despised cages. For years, she took commands from cruel cooks and arrogant betas. She refused to take another one while her chosen mate fought for his life. "I am not a prisoner anymore," she thought. She stopped pulling against his arm. She went limp for a fraction of a second, causing the Wing Lord to loosen his grip. Then she lunged forward. She bent her neck, opened her mouth, and sank her teeth into the exposed flesh between Rendar's gauntlet and his forearm plating. She bit down hard. She tasted salt and iron. The Lycan bite force, even from an Omega, carried enough pressure to crack bone. She intended to snap his wrist if he did not let go. The Wing Lord shouted in pain. Shock broke his discipline. He released her arm, staggering back to clutch his wounded wrist. He glared at her, raising his long sword in a moment of blind anger. Sophie did not wait for his retaliation. She spun on her heel and sprinted toward the crumbling glass. The zenith hung suspended above a violent thunderstorm. Lightning flashed in the dark clouds below the city, illuminating the sheer drop. The fractured panels squeaked and bowed under the pressure of the warring rulers. Every time the beast shifted its weight, another spiderweb crack shot across the transparent surface. The danger was palpable. The floor would not hold them for another minute. The wind howled around her. The clash of steel rang in her ears. She ignored the chaos of the broader war, locking her focus on the 2 monsters struggling at the edge of the world. Chapter 26. Sophie sprinted into the open. The beast heard her approaching footsteps. He possessed acute hearing, tracking every movement on the battlefield. He snapped his head toward the sound. He saw the Omega charging into the crossfire, unarmed and vulnerable. A cruel intelligence sparked in his yellow eyes. He saw a far better way to break the Emperor. He did not need to push his enemy through the glass. He could use the king's own weakness against him. The Alpha released his grip on the Emperor. He hopped backward, creating distance. He stood tall on his hind legs, filling his lungs with the freezing mountain air. He unleashed the Alpha voice. It was not a roar, it was a supernatural command, a magical compulsion that targeted the blood of every wolf in earshot. The alpha voice represented the unyielding hierarchy of the dirt. For centuries, pack leaders used it to silence dissent, punish rebels, and command armies without question. A lower-ranking wolf could not resist the biological imperative. The command bypassed logic, it bypassed fear, it turned survival instinct into a secondary concern. The sound hit Sophie like a physical blow. "Walk off the edge." The words echoed in her skull, overriding her own thoughts. Sophie stopped running. Her arms fell limp at her sides. The frantic beat of her heart slowed to a monotonous, detached rhythm. The world tunneled down to a single objective. She turned her body toward the shattered perimeter of the landing pad. She took a step forward. "No!" her mind screamed. "Stop moving!" She could not stop. Her muscles obeyed the alpha. She took another step, her boot crunching on a broken piece of crystal. The compulsion stripped away her free will, turning her into a meat puppet. She felt like a passenger trapped inside her own skin, screaming at the controls while the vehicle drove itself off a cliff. She fought it with every ounce of her willpower. She bit her tongue, trying to use the sharp pain to ground her senses. It did not work. Her right foot lifted, her knee bent. She took another mechanical stride. Tears streamed down her face, a silent protest against the hijacking of her flesh. She marched toward the fatal drop. 10 paces, 5 paces. The edge grew closer. The howling wind beckoned her to jump. She looked down at the swirling clouds. Lightning flashed, revealing the jagged mountain peaks thousands of feet below. She lifted her foot, preparing to take the final step into the abyss. Veraxis witnessed the betrayal. He saw the beast use ancient magic to force his heart horde toward her death. The sight shattered his composure. The stoic, calculating ruler vanished. Pure, unchecked dragon rage erupted from his core. The flames covering his arms turned white-hot, burning with the intensity of a dying sun. He opened his mouth and roared. The dragon roar carried the weight of the sky. It held the fury of a blazing star and the crushing pressure of the deep earth. It was a primordial force, a concussive wave of wrath that struck the courtyard with the power of a bomb. The sheer volume forced warriors to drop their weapons and cover their ears. The concussive blast rippled across the slick stone, sending cracks through the remaining intact panels of the courtyard. The sonic boom hit the alpha voice and obliterated it. The magical compulsion snapped. The invisible chains holding Sophie's mind dissolved in an instant. She regained control of her body mid-step. Gravity pulled her forward, her center of balance tipping over the edge of the drop. She flailed her arms, desperate to find an anchor. She twisted backward, throwing her weight away from the abyss. She crashed onto the solid stone, inches from the drop. She lay flat on her back, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking from the adrenaline and the residual magic. She survived, but the cost of breaking the spell demanded a terrible price from the king. Chapter 27. The concussive roar faded into a heavy, ringing silence. The effort drained the last reserves of the Emperor's strength. He had fought a grueling physical brawl, sustained deep wounds, and tapped into his deepest magical reserves to break the mind control. The toll proved too high. The fire fever struck with brutal timing. Veraxis stumbled. The white-hot flames licking up his scaled arms flickered, changed to a dull, sickly orange, and died. The oppressive heat radiating from his chest vanished, replaced by a sudden, unnatural chill. He dropped to his knees. The harsh impact echoed over the quiet courtyard. He clutched his chest, his fingers digging into his ruined clothing. A violent tremor shook his frame. He exhaled, and a thick cloud of white vapor escaped his lips, curling into the freezing mountain air. The sickness returned, starved and hungry. Without the constant feed of the Omega aura, the internal furnace collapsed. Frost bloomed across his black scales, turning the armor a pale, icy blue. His blood began to freeze. The fire fever did not just cool his body, it attacked his soul. The sickness turned his veins into rivers of ice. The cauterized wounds on his ribs cracked open as the flesh froze, weeping sluggish, dark blood that crystallized before it hit the floor. The Alpha recognized the shift. He understood the dragon had broken his own core to save the servant. A triumphant, guttural laugh bubbled up from the wolf's chest. The beast began to shrink. The terrifying snout receded. The dark gray fur vanished into the skin. Bones snapped and realigned, pulling the monster back into the shape of a man. The Alpha shifted back to his human form. He stood naked, covered in his own blood and the ash of his scorched chest. He wanted to savor this victory with a human mind. He wanted to hold the weapon that ended the sky. He walked across the battlefield, his bare feet leaving bloody prints on the glass. He reached down and picked up a discarded iron broadsword, dropped by a fallen enforcer. The weapon was heavy, crude, and lethal. The Alpha marched toward the freezing king. The Alpha reveled in the moment. He ignored the surrounding scale guards, who remained frozen in shock at the sight of their invincible ruler brought low. The war stopped to watch the execution. The red emergency lights pulsed, casting long, bloody shadows across the Alpha's scarred face. "You traded your life for a floor scrubber," the Alpha mocked, dragging the tip of the iron blade across the stone. Sparks flew from the friction. "A foolish end for a supposed god." He held the heavy iron broadsword with both hands, adjusting his grip to ensure a clean decapitation. He wanted the head to roll across the courtyard as a trophy for his clan. He wanted to parade the skull through the dirt streets. Veraxis could not respond. The frost crept up his neck, locking his jaw. His glowing eyes turned a muddy, lifeless brown. He remained planted on his knees, a statue of ice waiting for the final blow. Sophie pushed herself up from the edge of the abyss. She saw the Alpha raise the heavy iron broadsword above his head, aiming for the Emperor's exposed neck. "No!" She did not think. She did not hesitate. The tether connecting her to the frozen king pulled taut. She sprinted across the shattered crystal. She moved faster than she had ever moved in her life, driven by pure, desperate instinct. The distance seemed insurmountable. Her boots slipped on the bloody floor, but she found her balance, pushing off a broken stone planter for extra momentum. The iron broadsword hummed as it cut through the air, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of hatred between their species. Sophie tackled the frozen king, pulling his icy frame against her chest. The cold bit into her skin, but she ignored the sting. She wrapped her arms around his freezing shoulders. She shielded his neck with her own torso, offering her back to the descending iron. She closed her eyes, waiting for the cold bite of the steel to end her life. Chapter 28. The heavy iron broadsword descended. It aimed to cleave through bone and scale. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut. She tightened her grip on the freezing Emperor. In the face of certain death, she did not find panic. She found acceptance. She found the deep, quiet well of her true nature. She tapped into the power of her rank. The Omega aura erupted from her chest. It did not project as a gentle, calming blanket this time. It exploded outward like a shockwave of total, unnatural peace. The magic rippled across the entire courtyard, a physical force that hit every living creature on the landing pad. The effect was instantaneous. The aura smelled of fresh rain on dry earth, a scent that triggered primal memories of safety and full bellies. It carried the quiet hum of a secure den. For the warriors fighting on the platform, the sudden shift felt like waking from a fever dream. The urge to spill blood vanished, replaced by a profound, lethargic contentment. Across the battlefield, warriors dropped their weapons. Lycan enforcers let their heavy chains slip from their fingers, the metal clattering uselessly against the stone. Scale guards lowered their swords, the urge to kill wiped from their minds. The frantic heartbeat of the war stopped dead. A suffocating, heavy calm blanketed the mountain peak. The iron blade hovered a fraction of an inch above Sophie's back. The Alpha stood frozen mid-swing. The muscles in his arms strained. The veins in his neck bulged. The aura demanded peace, suppressing his violent intent with crushing magical weight. But the Alpha possessed a willpower forged in decades of brutal survival. He had slaughtered his way to the top of his clan, and he refused to let a servant dictate his actions. He hated the sky. He hated the servant who defied him. Blood dripped from his nose as the internal pressure built. He gritted his teeth, letting out a strained, strangled grunt. He fought the forced calm. He pushed against the magical barrier, forcing his arms to complete the execution. The blade trembled, inching closer to her spine. He was going to break through the peace. He was going to kill them both. Sophie felt the blade brush against her jacket. She opened her eyes. She looked down at the Emperor's face. His skin was the color of a bruised corpse. Frost coated his eyelashes. His chest did not rise. The fire fever had nearly completed its work. He was moments away from a frozen death. She needed to wake the forge. She needed the ultimate spark. She remembered the ancient tome in the dark study. She remembered the faded ink and the sharp, angled script detailing the cure for the sickness. The true name binds them. The spark of a chosen equal reignites the forge. Dragons guarded their true names with their lives. It was the key to their soul, a word that stripped away all defenses and laid their core bare. She had read it on the parchment, a secret kept from the entire world. She placed her hands on either side of his freezing face. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his icy brow. "Ignitar," she whispered. The word left her lips, carrying the full weight of her choice. She claimed him. The true name echoed in the quiet courtyard. It was not just a sound, it was a key. It unlocked the deepest chambers of his internal forge, bypassing the physical decay of the sickness. The magical binding tied his life force directly to hers. As long as she breathed, his fire would never die. The response was catastrophic. A blinding pillar of white-hot fire erupted from the Emperor's chest. The sudden blast of heat vaporized the frost in a microsecond. The force of the ignition threw the Alpha backward. The iron broadsword flew from his hands, melting into slag before it hit the floor. The fire did not burn Sophie. It enveloped her, a warm, protective shield. Veraxis opened his eyes. The muddy brown color was gone, replaced by twin suns of burning, molten gold. Life rushed back into his veins. The heart horde had spoken the binding word. The tether snapped into a permanent, unbreakable chain. He rose from the floor. He lifted Sophie with him, setting her safely behind his back. The king of the zenith stood tall, immune to the cold sickness forever. He radiated a heat that warped the very air around him, a true god of the sky reborn in fire. He turned his burning gaze upon the naked, cowering Alpha lying on the stone. The war was over. Chapter 29. The pillar of white-hot fire roared toward the heavens, a beacon that surely signaled the end of the night to the world below. Veraxis stood in the center of the inferno. The frost on his scales didn't just melt, it vanished. He pulled himself to his full height, his spine straightening with the crackle of a reignited forge. He felt the tether, the golden, pulsing link Sophie had forged with a single word, beating in time with his own heart. The cold was gone. The fire fever was dead. Veraxis stepped out of the flames. The air around him shimmered, warped by a heat so intense it turned the nearby puddles of rainwater to steam in a blink. He looked at Sophie. She stood just behind him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide. She looked small against the backdrop of the war, but she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. "Stay," he commanded. This time it wasn't a king's order to a servant, it was a dragon's promise to his horde. He turned his gaze to Alpha Noctar. The wolf leader scrambled backward on the glass. He had shifted to his human form to savor a kill, and now he was naked, vulnerable, and terrified. He reached for the hilt of his iron broadsword, but the metal had turned to a glowing, shapeless puddle of orange slag. He looked up at the Emperor, and for the first time in his long, bloody life, the Alpha knew he was outmatched. Veraxis moved. He didn't run, he blurred. He appeared in front of Noctar before the wolf could draw breath. He reached down and grabbed the alpha by the throat. Veraxis's scaled hand squeezed, his talons digging into the skin. He lifted the man off the floor with one arm. Noctar thrashed. He clawed at Veraxis's forearm, but his human fingernails broke against the dragon scales. He tried to summon the alpha voice again, but his throat was a crushed tube of meat and bone. Only a wet, pathetic wheeze escaped his lips. Veraxis raised his right hand. His fist began to glow. The heat gathered there, turning his skin translucent until the bones of his hand showed through like a dark skeleton inside a sun. He prepared the killing blow. He intended to drive that burning fist through Noctar's chest, melting his heart and spine into ash. The scale guards watched in grim silence. The Lycan enforcers cowered, waiting for the end of their master. The air smelled of impending death and scorched stone. Veraxis drew his arm back. The light from his hand was so bright it cast long, dancing shadows across the entire courtyard. "Veraxis, stop!" Sophie's voice cut through the roar of the wind. Veraxis paused. The fire in his fist flickered but didn't die. He didn't look back. "He tried to kill you, Sophie. He tried to break the sky. He dies." "If you kill him like this, you're just another monster with a crown," Sophie yelled, stepping forward until she was inches from the heat of his back. "The wolves will never stop fighting you. They'll just find another alpha with a bigger grudge. You want peace? Then don't start a blood feud that lasts 1,000 years. Veraxis growled, a deep, vibrating sound that shook the floor. "He deserves nothing but fire." "I know," Sophie said, her voice softening. "But do it for the ones who didn't choose this war. Do it for the Omegas scrubbing your floors who don't want to die for a dead man's pride." Veraxis stayed still for a long heartbeat. The heat radiating from his fist began to dim. He looked at Noctar. The man was turning purple, his eyes rolling back in his head. The Dragon King let out a sharp exhale. He didn't drop the alpha. He slammed him face first into the stone floor. The impact cracked the tiles. Veraxis kept his boot on the back of Noctar's neck, pinning him to the dirt where he belonged. Chapter 30. The courtyard fell into a suffocating silence. The only sound was the crackle of cooling glass and the distant wail of a dying siren. Veraxis stood over the broken alpha, his scaled chest heaving. The white-hot glow of his skin faded back to a steady, pulsing warmth. The Lycan enforcers stood huddled near the cargo lifters. They looked at their leader, then at the dragon god who had spared him. They expected a slaughter. They expected the sky to rain fire until the last wolf was a pile of charcoal. Veraxis looked at the scale guards. "Bring him to his feet." 2 guards stepped forward. They grabbed Noctar by the arms and hauled him up. The alpha's face was a mask of blood and grit. His right eye was swollen shut. He couldn't stand on his own. His knees wobbled like a newborn pup's. Veraxis stepped close, invading Noctar's personal space. The heat coming off the Emperor made the alpha flinch. "You wanted to see the sky fall," Veraxis said, his dual-layered voice echoing off the glass towers. "You brought iron and blood to my gate. You used a forbidden command on a member of my house." He reached out and grabbed Noctar's right hand. He looked at the bronze signet ring on the alpha's finger. With a sharp twist, Veraxis ripped the metal from the man's hand. "Noctar of the Iron Claw," Veraxis declared. "By the law of the duel you broke and the mercy I was shown, your reign ends here. You are no longer Alpha. You are no longer Pack. You are a nameless ghost of the dirt." Veraxis crushed the bronze ring in his palm. The metal groaned and flattened into a useless disc. He tossed it at Noctar's feet. "Banish him," Veraxis ordered. "My king?" Wing Lord Rendar asked, stepping forward from the perimeter. "We should execute the entire line. It is the only way to be sure." Veraxis turned a lethal stare on his general. Rendar recoiled, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword. "I have spoken," Veraxis barked. Strip him of his name. Throw him to the mountain passes. If he survives the climb down, let him rot in the woods. If I see his face again, I will not be talked out of the fire a second time." The scale guards dragged Noctar toward the edge of the landing pad, not to the sheer drop, but to the steep, treacherous stairs that led down the mountain's spine. The Alpha didn't fight them. He looked broken. His spirit had vanished the moment his ring was crushed. The remaining Lycan warriors watched their leader disappear into the darkness of the descent. They were leaderless. They were terrified. They stood in a circle of dragons, waiting for the sentence to fall on them next. Veraxis turned to the wolves. His eyes were still golden, still dangerous. "The man who led you is gone," Veraxis said. "You have a choice. You can follow him into the dark and die as rogues, or you can drop your chains and listen to someone who actually cares if you live to see tomorrow." He stepped aside, opening a path. Sophie walked into the center of the clearing. She looked at the scarred warriors she used to fear. She saw the blood on their leather vests and the desperation in their eyes. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like a girl in a ruined denim jacket. But the way the Emperor stood behind her told the wolves everything they needed to know. The Iron Claw warriors looked at each other. One by one, they dropped their iron chains. The metal clattered against the crystal floor, 100 echoes of a war that had just reached its end.
Chapter 31.
The sun began to peek over the jagged horizon, staining the cloud sea in shades of bruised orange and pink. The light hit the shattered glass of the courtyard, turning the battlefield into a field of diamonds. Noctar was gone, lost to the shadows of the lower peaks. The Iron Claw warriors sat on the stone, their heads bowed. They weren't prisoners in cages, but they had nowhere to go. Without an alpha, a Lycan pack was a body without a head. They felt the pull of the vacuum in their blood, the aimless, drifting panic of the disconnected. A scarred beta named Jacob stood up. He was a large man with a missing ear and a chest covered in old combat medals. He had been Noctar's right hand for a decade. He looked at the dragons, then he looked at Sophie. "You talk about peace, Omega," Jacob spat. His voice was a gravelly rasp. "You talk about mercy, but look at us. We are warriors. We were born to take what we need. Now we have no leader, no plan, and we are standing in a city that smells like a jewelry box." He stepped toward Sophie, his jaw set. A few of the other warriors stood up behind him. The instinct to follow the strongest wolf in the room was taking over. Jacob wasn't an alpha, but he was the closest thing they had left. "What are we supposed to do?" Jacob demanded. "Go back to scrubbing floors? Bow to a lizard king who thinks we are dirt?" The scale guards shifted, their hands tightening on their polearms. Veraxis took a step forward, his shadow falling over Sophie, but she put a hand out to stop him. "I've got this," she whispered. She stepped toward Jacob. She was half his size, but she didn't flinch. "You think being a warrior means picking fights you can't win?" Sophie asked. "Noctar didn't care about you. He didn't care about the clan. He wanted a throne in the clouds because his ego was too big for the dirt. He used your lives like kindling for a fire that was never going to keep you warm." "He gave us a purpose!" Jacob roared. "His purpose was a suicide pact!" Sophie snapped back. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Look around you, Jacob. You're standing on the most powerful fortress in the world. You have dragons who can boil the sea, and you think the best use of your life is to die on their front porch?" She walked in a circle, looking at the huddled wolves. "We don't need a tyrant to tell us we matter," she said. "The Iron Claw clan is more than a name on a map. It's the people who forge the steel and hunt the woods. We can trade with the sky. We can build something that isn't a war camp." Jacob laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Trade? With them? They'll give us scraps and call it a favor." "They'll give you what you earn," Sophie countered. She turned to Veraxis. Tell them the dirt isn't for walking on anymore." Veraxis crossed his arms. He looked at the ragged group of wolves. "The Omega speaks the truth. The war of the ancestors is a rot that serves no one. If you want resources, if you want safety, you will find it through the treaty we signed today. But if you want to fight, I am still standing here." The Emperor let a small lick of flame dance between his fingers. Jacob looked at the fire, then back at Sophie. He was wavering. The warrior's pride was a heavy thing to drop, but the exhaustion of the night was heavier. "And who speaks for us?" Jacob asked. "We have no alpha to sign your papers." Sophie straightened her spine. "You're looking at her." Chapter 32. The silence that followed was even heavier than the one after the gunshot. Jacob stared at Sophie like she had grown a second head. Behind him, the other wolves began to mutter. An Omega leading the Iron Claw? It was against every rule written in their blood. "You?" Jacob scoffed. He took a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "You are a floor scrubber. You are a runt who ran away the moment things got tough. You think these men will follow a girl who doesn't even have a scent of power on her?" Sophie didn't back down. She stepped into his space, her boots clicking on the glass. "I didn't run away," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. "I was snatched, and while I was up here, I saved the life of the man who could have turned your children to ash. I broke the alpha voice with nothing but my own head. What have you done lately, Jacob, besides losing a war and standing around waiting for someone to tell you where to go?" Jacob's face flushed dark red. He raised a hand, his fingers curling into a fist. "You watch your mouth, girl. Rank still matters." He swung. It wasn't a killing blow, but a fast, backhanded strike meant to put her in her place. Sophie didn't move. She didn't need to. A hand made of black scales caught Jacob's wrist mid-air. The sound of the impact was like a hammer hitting an anvil. Jacob's arm stopped dead. He let out a yelp of pain as the heat from Veraxis's palm began to singe his skin. Veraxis stepped out from behind Sophie. He didn't look like a human. He looked like a nightmare carved from obsidian. The scales on his face caught the morning light, and his eyes were pits of molten gold. "You will not touch her," Veraxis growled. The dual tone of his voice was so deep it made the metal chains on the floor vibrate. He squeezed Jacob's wrist. The beta dropped to his knees, his face twisting in agony. "She is the heart horde of the zenith," Veraxis declared, his voice carrying across the entire palace. "She is the fire in my chest and the reason the sun rose today. If you challenge her, you challenge the sky. If you disrespect her, you answer to the flame." He looked over the heads of the Lycan warriors, his gaze a physical weight. "She doesn't need an alpha's rank to lead you," Veraxis said. "She has the full power of the dragon lineage behind her. Every wing in this city, every drop of fire in my blood belongs to her. Does anyone else wish to test the strength of her position?" No one moved. Even the dragons in the scale guard looked at Sophie with a new, terrified respect. They had never seen their king declare a mate like this, not as a consort, but as a power equal to his own. Veraxis released Jacob's wrist. The beta collapsed to the floor, cradling his burnt arm. He looked up at Sophie, and for the first time, he didn't see an Omega. He saw a woman who had tamed a god. "The transition begins now," Sophie said, looking down at the fallen warrior. "Gather the wounded. Dragon healers are coming out. If you want to help, pick up a bandage. If you want to stay angry, the stairs are that way." She pointed to the descent. Jacob looked at his men. They were already moving toward the healers. The fight was gone. The old world was dead. He let out a long, weary sigh and bowed his head to her. "We await your orders, Lady Sophie." Sophie felt a shiver go down her spine. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of a new crown. She felt Veraxis's hand settle on the small of her back. His touch was warm, steady, and certain. "You did well," he whispered. "We aren't done yet," she replied, looking at the mess of her new kingdom. "We have a lot of floors to scrub." Veraxis chuckled, the sound deep and rich. "I think you've done enough cleaning for one lifetime." Chapter 33. The screaming stopped. Silence replaced the roar of fire and the clash of steel. It felt heavy, like a thick fog rolling over the mountain peak. Dragon healers moved through the wreckage of the courtyard. They worked side by side with Lycan doctors who carried kits made of worn leather and bone. White light from dragon palms met the pungent smell of wolf herbs. Sophie watched a healer wrap a bandage around Rendar's wrist. The Winglord winced, his face tight as he looked at the deep puncture marks Sophie had left in his skin. He didn't look at her with anger anymore. He looked at her with something that felt like dread. "I guess biting a general earns you a certain reputation," Sophie thought. "I'm the wolf who snacks on high-ranking officers." She turned away from the wounded. The courtyard was a mess. Shattered glass crunched under every step. Melted iron from Noctar's broadsword had cooled into a dark, ugly blotch on the stone. Dragon guards hauled the remaining Ironclaw warriors toward the barracks, but they didn't use chains. The war had changed into a weary, confused truce. Sophie walked back into the sun ballroom. She found the small canvas sack she had arrived with. It wasn't much, a spare rag, a piece of dried meat. She reached into her pocket and felt the uncut ruby Veraxis had given her. It felt like a hot coal against her thigh. She pulled the stone out. It sparkled in the morning light, a deep red that matched the blood still staining the floors outside. "I can't keep this," she told herself. "I'm a floor scrubber. I belong where the grit stays under your fingernails. This city is too bright, too clean. It shows every flaw." She stuffed the ruby into the bag. She didn't want to be a heart hoard. She didn't want to lead a clan that had spent years treating her like a stray dog. She wanted the quiet. She wanted the dirt where she knew the rules. Sophie shouldered her bag. She didn't go looking for Veraxis. She knew where he was, standing on the edge of the landing pad, issuing orders to Rendar. He looked like a god again, his power restored and his posture unyielding. He didn't need a servant. He had his city back. She navigated the crystal halls one last time. She avoided the main elevators, taking the narrow service stairs used by the staff. Her muscles ached. Every step felt like a chore. The high-altitude air still bit at her lungs, a constant reminder that she didn't possess wings. She reached the eastern landing bay. The secondary transports sat in rows, sleek and silent. A few workers prepped a cargo ship for a flight down to the valley depots to gather supplies for the wounded. Sophie marched toward the open ramp of a supply vessel. She didn't look back at the glass towers. She didn't think about the kiss on the balcony or the way the true name had tasted on her tongue. "Go back to the dirt, Sophie. At least down there, the only thing that can break is your heart, not the whole sky." A shadow stretched across the metal ramp. It was long and broad, blocking the sun. Sophie stopped. She didn't need to turn around to know who stood behind her. The air temperature rose 10 degrees in a single second. The familiar heat wrapped around her like a physical weight, pinning her to the spot. "Where do you think you are going?" Veraxis's voice carried a rough edge. It wasn't a roar, but it held the vibration of a tectonic plate shifting. Sophie gripped the strap of her bag. She forced her boots to turn. She looked at him, refusing to let the intimidation win. He stood there, the dual layers of his voice gone, but his presence still filled the entire bay. "The war is over," Sophie said. "You won. The wolves are following orders. You don't need a floor scrubber anymore." Veraxis took a step forward. The metal ramp groaned under his stride. "I never needed a floor scrubber. I needed you." "I'm going home, Veraxis. Take your ruby back." She reached into her bag, but he moved faster. He grabbed her wrist, his touch firm and hot. "The sky is your home now," he stated. "I belong in the dirt," she snapped. "Look at me. I don't fit in your ice halls. I don't want to sign your treaties. I just want to breathe air that doesn't feel like a punishment." Sophie pulled her arm back, but he didn't let go. The cliffhanger of their future hung between them, as sharp and dangerous as the drop off the mountain ridge. Chapter 34. Veraxis didn't flinch. He didn't move his hand from her wrist. He stared at her with a focus that made Sophie feel like she was the only object left in the universe. He thinks he can just command me to stay, she thought. Dragons and their greed. They find a shiny pebble and think they own the mountain it came from. You saved my life, Veraxis said. His tone lacked the arrogance of a king. It sounded like a confession. You spoke my name. You bound your soul to mine to stop the ice. Do you think I can just watch you walk onto a cargo ship and disappear into the fog? I did what I had to do, Sophie argued. She tried to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs. That doesn't mean I want a throne. I like the ground. I like the rain. I like knowing that if I fall, I only drop 6 inches, not 6 miles. The dirt is where you were a slave, Veraxis countered. He stepped closer, forcing her to look up. Noctar treated you like trash. Jacob tried to strike you. Why go back to a place that gave you nothing but scars and grease? Because I know who I am down there, Sophie yelled. Her voice echoed off the hull of the skyjet. Up here, I'm a freak. I'm the wolf who saved the dragon. Your lords hate me. Your generals want to execute me. I'm a guest who is really a prisoner. Veraxis let go of her wrist. He didn't back away. He crossed his arms, his posture rigid. You are no prisoner. The doors are open. The ship is ready. If you truly wish to return to the mud, I will not stop you. Sophie blinked. She looked at the open ramp of the transport. The pilot was watching them, his eyes wide. The path to her old life sat right there. She could walk away. She could find a quiet corner of the lower city, change her name, and never look at a cloud again. So why aren't my feet moving? She wondered. Why does the idea of that quiet corner feel like a grave? You belong where you are valued, Veraxis continued. I do not care about the opinions of my lords. They serve at my whim. You saved the Zenith. You gave the Iron Claw a future they didn't deserve. You are the Heart Horde, my horde. I am not a gemstone for you to lock in a vault, Sophie snapped. I have a mind. I have a pet. I have a life that doesn't involve being your favorite trophy. Veraxis tilted his head. A spark of humor touched his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Oz is currently eating the decorative flora in the ballroom. He seems to enjoy the high life more than you do. Oz is a tortoise. He'd be happy in a dumpster if it had fresh lettuce. And you? Veraxis stepped into her space. The heat from his chest was a wall. What makes you happy, Sophie? Scrubbing floors for a man who hates you? Or standing on the balcony with me? Sophie looked away. She remembered the kiss. She remembered the feeling of the fire protecting her while the alpha tried to break her. The tether in her chest pulled tight, a golden thread that refused to snap. I can't be a queen, she whispered. I don't know the rules. Then we will burn the rulebook, Veraxis said. I am the king. I decide what a queen looks like, and right now, she looks like a woman who isn't afraid to bite a wing lord. Sophie let out a jagged breath. She looked at the transport ship again. The dirt was calling, but the fire was right here. She didn't know if she was brave enough to stay, or if she was just too tired to run anymore. I'm going to make your life a nightmare, Sophie warned. Veraxis smirked. My life was a frozen void until you arrived. I look forward to the nightmare. He offered his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. Sophie looked at his palm, then back at the ramp. She made her choice. Chapter 35. Sophie didn't take his hand. Not yet. She stood on the metal ramp, her bag clutched to her chest. The wind from the landing pads whipped around them, carrying the scent of snow and cooling metal. If I stay, Sophie said, her voice steady, things change. I don't bow. I don't follow your forbidden protocols, and your lords are going to have to get used to the smell of honest labor, because I'm not changing who I am. Veraxis watched her. He didn't speak. He seemed to be weighing her words. He's going to back down, Sophie thought. No dragon king accepts terms from a wolf. He's too proud. His ego is bigger than the palace. Veraxis moved. He didn't step back. He didn't roar. He dropped to one knee. The sound of his knee hitting the metal ramp was like a thunderclap in the quiet bay. The workers stopped moving. The pilot of the transport ship dropped his clipboard. Rendar, who had just walked into the bay to deliver a report, froze in his tracks, his jaw hitting his chest. The Emperor of the Zenith, the ruler of the clouds, the man who commanded the fire of the stars, was kneeling. He bowed his head. He placed his hand over his heart, showing the raw vulnerability of his position. He was bowing to an Omega wolf. Sophie felt the air leave her lungs. Her heart skipped a beat. She had spent her entire life being forced to the floor. She had been kicked, shoved, and ordered to kneel until her joints ached. Now, the most powerful being she had ever met was doing it for her, without a command, without a threat. "I do not ask you to be a queen by my side," Veraxis said, his voice vibrating through the ramp. "I ask you to be the soul of this city. I bow to the strength that saved me. I bow to the mate who chose me when I was a statue of ice. If you stay, you are not my servant. You are my equal, my superior. The sky belongs to you." Is this real? Sophie wondered. A dragon king on his knees in front of a floor scrubber. If I had a camera, I could sell this for enough to buy the whole valley. She looked at Rendar. The general looked like he was having a stroke. She looked at the workers. They were all staring in stunned silence. The rigid hierarchy of the world had just been flipped upside down. Sophie felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with Veraxis's fire. It was pride, real, jagged pride. She wasn't just a wolf who got lucky. She was the woman who had tamed the sky. She let her canvas bag slip from her shoulder. It hit the ramp with a dull thud. She reached out. She grabbed Veraxis by the collar of his ruined shirt. She didn't use a gentle touch. She gripped the fabric tight and yanked him upward. Veraxis rose, his eyes locked on hers. He looked surprised by her force. Sophie pulled him down. She didn't wait for him to lean in. She stood on her tiptoes and smashed her lips against his. The kiss was a declaration. It tasted like smoke, victory, and the future. Sophie poured all her defiance, all her fear, and all her hope into it. She felt his arms wrap around her waist, lifting her off her feet. He held her like she was the only treasure in his hoard that mattered. Around them, the landing bay remained silent. The shock was too great for words. Sophie broke the kiss, her chest heaving. She kept her hands on his shoulders. "Get up, Ignitar," she whispered, using the name only she was allowed to speak. "We have a treaty to sign, and I'm pretty sure your lords are going to need a lot of wine to handle what's coming next." Veraxis laughed, a deep, rich sound that echoed off the towers. He set her down on her feet. "Let them choke on it," he said. He kept his arm around her waist as they walked off the ramp. Sophie didn't look at her bag. She didn't look at the transport ship. She looked straight ahead, toward the palace that was no longer a cage. It was her kingdom now, and she was going to make sure it ran exactly how she wanted. Chapter 36. The Treaty Council was a disaster before it even started. The High Lords of the Zenith sat on one side of the long crystal table. They wore their finest silks, crushed violet, sunlit gold, and midnight blue. They looked like a collection of expensive dolls, their faces frozen in expressions of polite disgust. Across from them sat the Lycan betas. Jacob sat in the center, his right arm wrapped in a thick white bandage that was already stained with grease. The wolves looked like they wanted to chew on the table rather than sit at it. The air in the room was thick with tension. It smelled of expensive perfume and wet dog. "We cannot grant the dirt dwellers access to the crystal mines," a lord in a violet coat stated. He sniffed a silk handkerchief. "It is a violation of our ancestral sovereignty." Jacob slammed his good hand on the table. The crystal rang. "Your sovereignty didn't stop us from hijacking your lifters, did it? We need the ore for the forges. Our people are cold." "Then buy wood," the lord snapped, "like civilized creatures." "With what?" Jacob roared. "You've been strangling our trade routes for a century." Veraxis sat at the head of the table. He looked bored. He leaned back in his tall chair, watching the bickering like a man watching a play he'd seen too many times. Sophie sat beside him. She had refused to change into a gown. She still wore her apron, though she had washed the soot from her face. This is going to take all day, Sophie thought. They're like children fighting over a sandbox. She looked at the lords. She looked at the wolves. Nobody was listening. They were all too busy trying to prove they were the toughest person in the room. The door to the council chamber creaked open. A scratching sound filled the room. It was slow, grating, rhythmic. Every head turned. Oz the tortoise crawled into the center of the room. He moved with agonizing slowness. He bypassed the guards. He ignored the lords. He marched straight toward the crystal table. The lords stared in confusion. Jacob frowned, recognizing the reptile. Oz reached the base of the table. He looked up. Then, with a series of heavy grunts and scrabbling claws, he began to climb. He used a discarded velvet cloak hanging from a chair as a ramp. The council watched in dead silence. It took Oz 3 full minutes to reach the top. He hauled himself onto the crystal surface. He looked around the room with his ancient, blinking eyes. Then he spotted a decorative bowl in the center of the table. It was filled with rare, high-altitude greens and crisp lettuce, meant as a snack for the lords. Oz crawled into the bowl. The sound of his shell hitting the crystal was the only noise in the room. He reached down, grabbed a large, crisp leaf of romaine, and began to chew. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sight was so bizarre that the anger in the room simply evaporated. The pale lord in the violet coat opened his mouth to complain, but no words came out. Jacob let out a confused snort. Sophie smirked. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. If a tortoise can make it all the way from the West Wing to this table without starting a fight, Sophie said, her voice cutting through the silence, I think you lot can manage to share a mine. He's currently eating your lunch and nobody is stopping him. Why? Because it's a turtle. It's not a threat. She looked at Jacob. The crystal mines aren't a weapon, she said. They're a resource. If the sky provides the heat and the dirt provides the steel, we both get richer. Or you can keep yelling until Oz finishes the whole bowl. Oz let out a quiet hiss and took another massive bite of lettuce. Veraxis chuckled. He looked at his lords, then at the betas. The tension had snapped. The absurdity of the tortoise had forced everyone to realize how petty they were being. The Omega is right, Veraxis stated. He looked at Rendar. Draft the mining permit, 50-50 split. The wolves provide the labor. We provide the refining magic. Rendar hesitated, then nodded. He began to write. The lords slumped in their seats, defeated by a reptile. Jacob grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. Sophie reached out and patted Oz's shell. Good job, buddy, she whispered. The Treaty Council was finally moving. The war was officially ending, not with a bang, but with the sound of a tortoise eating salad. Chapter 37. The ink dried on the parchment. It looked like a death warrant for the old ways and a birth certificate for the new. Rendar rolled the scroll, his movements stiff. The council chamber felt less like a tomb and more like a room that finally held air. Jacob stood up, his bandaged arm pinned to his chest. He didn't look at the lords, he looked at Sophie. He waited for a sign that the dirt wouldn't get stomped on the moment they left the mountain. The treaty is done, Sophie said. Her voice didn't shake. Jacob, take your men back to the camp. Tell them the crystal mines belong to the workers now. No more starvation, no more suicide runs. Jacob nodded. He signaled the other betas. They left the room with more dignity than they had entered it. The lords followed, whispering in corners, their violet and gold fabrics rustling like dry leaves. Only Veraxis and Sophie remained, along with Oz, who had fallen asleep inside the salad bowl. I need to go back to the camp for an hour, Sophie said. She didn't ask permission. I have unfinished business in the kitchen. Veraxis leaned against the crystal table. She wants to settle a debt. I should let the fire breathe, but she handles her own storms. I will have a skyjet prepped. Rendar will escort you. Rendar stays here, Sophie countered. I'm going alone. I'm the leader of the Iron Claw now. I don't need a babysitter with wings. The skyjet touched down in the center of the Lycan territory. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and black. Sophie stepped off the ramp. The camp felt different. The warriors didn't growl. They watched her with a mixture of confusion and awe. She marched straight for the kitchen. The heat hit her first, then the smell of raw meat and grease. Head cook Lyria stood by the large iron stove, screaming at a young Omega. Lyria turned when the door slammed open. Her face went pale, then shifted into a fake, greasy smile. "Sophie!" Lyria gushed. She wiped her hands on her stained front. "We heard the news! The Emperor's favorite! I always knew you were destined for the clouds. I told everyone you had a spark." "You told me I would paint the snow red before sunrise," Sophie thought. Lies taste like ash. "Save it, Lyria," Sophie said. She walked to the center of the kitchen. The other servants stopped working. They gathered in the shadows, their eyes wide. "I'm not here for a chat. I'm here to sign your termination papers." Lyria's smile curdled. "You can't fire me. I've run this kitchen for 20 years. These runts wouldn't know how to boil water without me." "They'll learn," Sophie said. She pointed to a kind Omega named Quinn, who stood shivering by the flour sacks. "Quinn, the kitchen is yours. You're the head cook now. Double the rations for the servants. No more beatings. No more moldy bread." Quinn gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Lyria lunged forward, her face twisting into a mask of rage. "You little thief! You think because you slept your way to the top you can—" Sophie didn't wait for the insult to finish. She stepped into Lyria's space. She didn't use a weapon. She didn't need one. She unleashed a fraction of the piece she held in her chest, but she made it heavy. She made it a cage. Lyria choked on her words. The sudden, forced calm hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her knees buckled. She fell back against the prep table, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Get out," Sophie commanded. "Take your things and leave the territory. If I see you near the forges or the kitchens again, I won't use a command. I'll let Jacob handle the discipline. And he's had a very long night." Lyria scrambled for the exit. She didn't look back. The kitchen fell into a stunned silence. Sophie looked at the servants, her old friends, her brothers and sisters in the dirt. "The sky is trading with us now," Sophie told them. "You aren't slaves. You're the engine of the clan. Clean this place up. We have a lot of work to do." She walked out of the kitchen, leaving the memory of the kitchen's shadow behind. She felt a pull in her chest, the tether. Veraxis was waiting. She headed for the skyjet, her boots thudding on the cobblestones. The dirt felt familiar, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. Chapter 38. The sun dipped low, casting long orange shadows across the zenith courtyard. The wreckage had been cleared. The crystal floor remained cracked, a jagged reminder of the battle, but the red emergency lights had been extinguished. Sophie stood by the railing. The heights still made her stomach flip. She gripped the crystal barrier, her knuckles white. "You promised me a flight," she said. She didn't turn around. She felt his heat before she heard his boots. Veraxis stopped beside her. "I did, but a skyjet is a cold way to see the world." "What's the alternative? You going to throw me over your shoulder and jump?" "In a way." Veraxis stepped back. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "She fears the drop, but she faced a god for me. It is time she sees what she truly bound herself to." "I have not shifted in 500 years, Veraxis said. His voice dropped to that dual-layered growl. "My ancestors warned that the fire would consume us if we stayed in the beast form too long. But the ice is gone. The forge is full." "Veraxis, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He closed his eyes. The sound started as a low hum in the air. Then came the snap. It sounded like a whip cracking against a stone wall. Veraxis's body began to expand. His dark clothes tore, the fabric shredded by the sheer force of the growth. Sophie backed away. She watched his spine arch. Black scales didn't just ripple across his skin this time, they erupted. They were thick, armored plates that caught the dying sunlight like polished obsidian. His limbs elongated. His hands became massive talons that gouged the stone floor. A tail, thick and whip-like, smashed through a decorative pillar. Then came the wings. They unfurled with a sound like a sail catching a gale. They were vast, translucent membranes stretched over obsidian bone, blocking out the sky. The transformation finished with a roar that shook the very foundation of the mountain. Where the man had stood, a nightmare now lived. A towering dragon of ink and fire. He stood 30 feet tall at the shoulder. His scales were a forest of black glass. Heat rolled off him in visible waves, distorting the air. He lowered his head, his snout the size of a carriage. Sophie froze. She looked into his eyes. They were no longer human. They were massive pits of fire, burning with an intelligence that felt ancient and primal. He's a monster, she thought. A beautiful, terrifying monster. The dragon let out a soft huff of steam. He lowered his shoulder, tucking one massive wing back to create a ramp. He looked at her, waiting. Sophie looked at the clawed feet. She looked at the scales that could probably crush her without trying. Then she looked at the tether in her chest. It wasn't cold. It was glowing. "You better not drop me, Ignitar," she whispered. She stepped forward. She reached out and touched his side. The scales felt hot like a stovetop, but they didn't burn. They felt like power. She grabbed a ridge of bone and began to climb. She hauled herself onto the base of his neck, right between the massive shoulder blades. The heat from his core sank into her legs. She felt the vibration of his breathing, a rhythmic thrum that matched her own pulse. The dragon shifted. He stood up, lifting her high above the courtyard. "I hate heights!" Sophie yelled, clutching the scales. The dragon let out a sound that might have been a laugh. He turned toward the edge of the landing pad. He didn't hesitate. He didn't give her time to change her mind. He launched. Chapter 39. The world vanished. Gravity turned into a cruel joke. Sophie's stomach didn't just flip, it stayed in the courtyard while the rest of her shot into the void. She let out a scream that was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Veraxis plunged off the mountain edge. For 5 seconds they were in freefall. The air tore at Sophie's hair. It threatened to rip her clothes from her body. She buried her face against the hot black scales, her fingers locked into the grooves of his armor. Then the wings snapped shut. The jerk nearly dislocated her shoulders. The dragon caught the air. The fall turned into a glide, then into a climb. With one massive beat of his wings, Veraxis sent them soaring upward. Sophie opened one eye. They were slicing through the clouds. The white mist felt like damp silk against her skin. Then they broke through the top of the storm. The view killed the scream in her throat. The sun sat on the edge of the world, a giant, bleeding heart. The sky was a gradient of fire, purple, crimson, and deep, bruised gold. Below them, the cloud sea looked like a field of frozen cotton, glowing with the light of the setting sun. There was no dirt, no grease, no iron cages, just the infinite. Veraxis leveled out. He moved with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for a beast of his size. Every wing beat was a thunderclap. Every tilt of his body was a masterclass in power. Sophie let go of her fear. She loosened her grip on his scales. She sat up, the wind whipping her face. "Ignitar!" she shouted. The dragon turned his head. One massive eye looked back at her. He let out a low, vibrating hum that rumbled through her entire skeleton. He began the sky dance. He dove. He spun. He performed a slow barrel roll that sent Sophie's head spinning. She didn't fall. The heat from his body seemed to create a localized gravity, keeping her pinned to his back. She felt the rush of the air. She felt the raw, unfiltered freedom of the sky. She threw her head back and laughed. It was a sound of pure, jagged joy. It was the sound of a girl who had spent her life in a kitchen realizing she owned the stars. She wasn't an Omega. She wasn't a servant. She was a rider of the storm. They soared over the jagged peaks of the mountain range. They chased the retreating sunlight until the first stars began to blink in the velvet dark. Veraxis flew through a canyon of clouds, his black scales reflecting the moonlight. He was showing her his world. He was showing her the beauty he had been willing to freeze for. Sophie leaned forward, pressing her cheek against the back of his head. "I get it now," she thought. "Why you hide up here. It's not just about the power, it's the peace." The dragon banked left, heading back toward the glowing lights of the zenith. The flight was ending, but the feeling remained. The dirt was still down there, and the mines still needed working, but Sophie knew she would never truly be grounded again. She had found her hoard, and it had wings. Chapter 40. The landing was a soft thud on the central courtyard. Veraxis folded his wings, the massive membranes tucking against his sides with a heavy rustle. He lowered his shoulder, and Sophie slid down his scales, her legs shaky as they hit the stone. She stood there, breathing in the cold night air. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was flushed from the wind. The shift happened in reverse. The dragon shrank. The scales receded into the skin. The talons softened into fingers. In a matter of seconds, Veraxis stood before her in the moonlight. He was bare-chested, his skin still radiating an intense, pulsing heat. He looked tired, but his eyes held a peace she hadn't seen since the study. "Was it enough?" he asked. Sophie stepped toward him. She didn't look at his scars. She didn't look at the palace behind him. She looked at the man. "It was a start," she said. A quiet scratching sound broke the moment. Oz crawled out from behind a shattered planter. The tortoise looked satisfied. He had clearly finished the salad bowl and was now looking for a warm place to sleep. He bumped his shell against Veraxis's boot. Veraxis looked down at the reptile. He let out a quiet chuckle. "He survives everything, even a war." "He's a survivor," Sophie said. "Just like me." The morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, the first light of a new era. In the lower city, the forges were starting up, but this time, the steel was for tools, not just cannons. Dragon healers were heading down to the valley to teach the Lycan doctors their magic. The sky and the dirt were finally talking. Sophie felt the weight of the ruby in her pocket. She pulled it out and held it up to the morning light. "I'm still not wearing a crown, Ignitar," she warned. Veraxis wrapped his hand over hers, closing her fingers around the stone. "You don't need one. You are the heart hoard. The crown is just a piece of gold. You are the fire." He pulled her close. The morning air was crisp, but between them, the temperature was perfect. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead. "What happens now?" Sophie asked. "Now," Veraxis said, looking out over his united realm. "We build a kingdom that doesn't need to be afraid of the dark." Sophie smiled. She looked down at Oz, who had finally tucked his head into his shell for a nap. She looked at the dragon who had knelt for her. Then she looked at the horizon. The world was big. It was messy. It was full of people who still had a lot to learn. But for the first time in her life, Sophie wasn't looking for an exit. She was home. Veraxis pulled her into a final kiss as the sun broke through the clouds. The zenith glowed like a diamond in the sky. The war was a ghost. The future was a flame. The end. Quick favor, don't go anywhere yet. If you thought Sophie was brave for biting a winglord and claiming a dragon king as her own, wait until you meet the heroine in this next story on your screen. She makes Sophie look like a choir girl, and the alpha she's dealing with is about to learn that some wolves aren't meant to be tamed. You have to hear this disaster unfold. Click the video on your screen right now. It is pure chaos.